Hey, well, good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you today, and wanted to just thank you guys for spending a little bit of time with me as we get together and we go over some of the material that we need to discuss today in preparation for our AP World History exam. I also wanted to just let you guys know that I'm going to be posting some information on the AP World History exam on Teams a bit later today. They've decided that there still is going to be a World History exam. That test is going to be done at home online, and it's going to be modified for the conditions and the situation. So good morning, Isai, and to Austin and to Noah. Good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you guys today. Good morning, Abigail. Glad to see you as well. And so just as we're kind of gathering here this morning, just want to let you guys know that the AP board is still going to go ahead with the test. It is going to be a modified test. That is still our goal, is to do the very best to prepare you with the content so that you can walk into that testing situation to be able to do the best that you can. So that's my job, and I want to be faithful to my job in preparing you for that. This morning, what we're going to be talking about is how the industrialization is impacting some living conditions for people, how industrialization is impacting a living condition for people. One of the things that you hopefully saw in one of the documents that we'll be talking about today is a document that is going to be talking about the problems with the tenements, the problems with how society in the industrial age is kind of sorting out, these new conditions. And on the very top, there's this lyric from a musical, maybe a musical with Johnny Depp in it called Sweeney Todd. And there's a song that kind of describes the conditions in the city of London. It says, "There's a hole in the world like a great black pit, and the vermin of the world inhabit it. And its morals aren't worth what a pig can spit, and it goes by the name of London. At the top of the hole sit a privileged few, making mock of the vermin in the lower zoo." And so, here's this song from this musical, Sweeney Todd. I don't know if any of you've seen this musical with Johnny Depp in it, but this musical kind of is set in this time period where you have this city of London, the city of prosperity, the city of wealth. And even though this is a city in many ways at the center of the world, you have so many people living in such poor conditions. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how industrialization has an impact on the urban world. One of the things is that at this time, working families crowded into poor quality buildings called tenements. And these tenements, this is one of the first things that we're talking about. These tenements are these incredibly poor quality housing projects. And these tenements are these crowded buildings where people are forced to live out of necessity. The United States in general, and the New York City area in particular, was flooded at this time with a second wave of immigration. There was a second wave of immigration that came into the United States in the mid 1800s and on. There was a second wave of immigration. So our country has always been a country of migrants. And one of the first general types of people that moved to the United States typically were people in a first wave, mainly from Northern Europe and people from Western Europe. That means people from Britain, people who are Irish, people who are English, people who are Scottish, people who are German, people who are French, typically people who were from Western Europe or Northern Europe. That was like that first wave of immigration. But then there was a second wave of immigration. And these people tended to be poorer than the first wave of immigrants. In fact, this second wave were often from Southern or Eastern Europe. This second wave was often from Southern or Eastern Europe. So the first wave of migrants were from the North. The first wave of immigrants were from Western Europe. Generally, though there were still many for sure that came poor, these migrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were even poorer than that first wave. And as they came from places like Italy, they came from places like Greece and like Russia, they often had little English skills. They often had very little English that they brought with them. So these people are from different parts of Europe. They're white, but they were often considered less than compared to the other white Europeans. So not all, there's even a sense of what it means to be white. And not all levels of white migrants, not all levels of white immigrants were all treated the same. And so for sure, these new groups of people, the second wave, people from Southern and Eastern Europe were treated less than. They were often also religious minorities. They were often either Catholic or Jewish. They're often either Catholic or Jewish. Now, they're also, if we're talking about people from Greece, if we're talking about people from Russia, they're also going to be a third religious minority. These people are going to be Orthodox. So in general, the United States in the 1800s in general, and New York City in particular, was flooded with a second wave of immigrants. The second wave of immigrants were from either the South or the Eastern part of Europe. They often came with very little English. They often were either Catholic, Jewish, or Orthodox. All these things mean that they're going to be treated poorly. They're going to be treated as outsiders. These people don't speak English. They're not Protestant. They're from a different part of Europe. They're often poorer. These people not only are going to be treated differently, but they're going to even be put into housing conditions that are for sure less than ideal. These housing conditions called the tenements. Many of these tenements, these crowded apartment buildings, often had windowless internal rooms. What I mean by that is, there was, if you get an apartment today, you're gonna have, windows, that you're gonna be able to see outside, but trying to get as many people into these buildings as possible, many of these people, these tenement dwellers, lived in internal rooms. That means building rooms inside of the building that it had been subdivided so many times that you have a room in this building, but there's no window outside, And so many of us today, we are in quarantine in 2020. And to some degree, we're fortunate that we have, many of us, access to a yard, a backyard. We have some sort of outdoor, abilities. People are walking and riding their bikes more than I've ever seen in my life in April of 2020. People are walking dogs that, from the looks of these dogs, have never been walked ever before. But imagine how much more challenging our lives would be in quarantine in 2020 if you didn't even have the ability to look out your window. You didn't even have the ability at all in your day. Now, not even saying, some of us go to, schools that don't have internal windows, right? But imagine like your home. This is where you go at the end of a day after working in maybe a windowless factory. You go home and this is your life. There's no sunshine. There's no sunlight. There's none of those things. That for sure is going to make an impact. One of the things people talked about in quarantine is just being able to go outside, what a difference that makes, being able to see outside, to have fresh air. And imagine you have to deal with the difficulties of disease, the difficulties of winter, of it getting dark so early, and you don't even have a window in your house. And so that's some of the conditions that these people had. Also, it says just how many people are flooding into New York and to these tenements. it says that in New York City alone, in 1865, there was 500,000 people living in these tenements. There was at least 500,000 people living in these tenements. So people are crowded into these poor working tenements. Primarily, they're crowded into these tenements because New York City was flooded with a second wave of immigrants. These second wave of immigrants, often from Southern or Eastern Europe, they often had very little English. They're often Catholic, Jewish, or Orthodox. And the actual physical rooms were these internal rooms that had no access to sunlight. 500,000 people, we think, lived in these tenements just in New York City alone. And to make problems even more challenging, some of you are thinking about, what is it going to be like when you go to college, when you go to university, and you have choices to make. Some kids move away to university, to college, and you decide to live in a dorm, and there's all kinds of situations where you're going to get a random roommate. What if you like the guy? What if you hate that girl? Others, if you say, well, I don't really want to do that, I'm going to live in an apartment with people I know. When I went to school, I lived in Jester Dormitory, which is like the largest dormitory at the University of Texas. And at that time, Jester was like considered like the worst dormitory at the University of Texas and the cheapest. And part of that is there's communal restrooms, which meant that like you don't have a restroom in your dormitory. You have to share a restroom with the hall. So, you have a hall of, I don't know, 25 rooms, 30 rooms, something like that. And there's like one communal restroom, and it has showers and sinks and all that kind of stuff. And so for bathroom needs, for showering needs, you have these communal restroom situations. And for a lot of people, that's not an ideal setting. And that's what these apartments had as well. These tenements also had communal restrooms. And so on average, the best circumstances that you could hope for was that there was one restroom for every 20 people. That was like the best. Actually, the city of New York had realized that there was problems with so many people sharing restrooms, that this one restroom for every 20 was actually the result of reforms. That was what they had pushed to make it like the standard. So that was like the best you could hope for, was like one restroom for 20 people. A lot of you guys are in quarantine, and maybe you have 2 restrooms in your house, maybe 3 restrooms in your house. And even sometimes with that, it could be challenging, just to, keep it clean. Like if you've ever if you share a restroom with a boy, if you share a restroom with a teenage boy or a little kid, like just think about like what your seat is like, honestly, throughout the day, with having little kids, with having men, with having boys. If you've ever used a restroom anywhere other than a Buc-ee's, think about what the restroom situation's like, and then realize that these people in these tenements are sharing a restroom with 20 people at the best. 20 people at the best, these communal restrooms. So it's definitely a very challenging situation. In 1890, New York City was the most densely populated city in the world. New York City by 1890 was the most densely populated city in the world. People are coming to the United States. People are coming to America. And for many people, the place that they would first enter in through is going to be New York City. In 1890, people are flooding to the United States. There's hope, there's opportunities, there's a sense that this is a place where there's dreams can be made, where a new future can be had. And New York City is the place that they're coming into. By 1890, the United States city of New York is the most densely populated city in the world. In fact, look in 1890, the Lower East Side, this is a reference to the, New York City has 5 boroughs. There's Staten Island, there's Manhattan, there's Queens, there's Brooklyn, and there's the Bronx. Those 5 neighborhoods, those 5 boroughs make what we call New York City. And one of those boroughs is Manhattan Island. That's where like most of the imagery that you can picture of New York City is in. And Manhattan Island, the Lower East Side of that island, became the most densely populated as all these migrants and immigrants are moving here to the city. And on average, we think the Lower East Side at this time in 1890 had about 800 people per acre. 800 people per acre. That's a lot. In fact, in 1890, that made New York City the most dense, this part of New York City, the most densely populated in the world. At 800 people per acre, that was more people than in many, if not all, Indian cities at the time. When we think about overpopulation or crowding or whatever, we think about places like India. But at this time, New York City was the leading city that had all this population density. They're putting up these poor quality houses. They were trying to do all these things. And the problem is these housing were terrible. There was disease that was common. They were so poorly made. They would sometimes collapse. Fires could occur and it would be devastating. We actually saw a video last week or so about the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire and how the role of fire could really be just devastating for these communities. To give you an estimate of like what that kind of crowding, that density is like, it'd be useful to look at some numbers by comparison. Think about LaPorte, Texas. LaPorte, Texas is a suburb of Houston. I think we're about 17 miles away from downtown Houston. And the population density per square mile of LaPorte, Texas is 1,874. That's how many people live in LaPorte. In a square mile of LaPorte, you have 1,874 people living every square mile. So now we're going to kind of compare that to Houston general and then to New York City at the time. So today, LaPorte has about a population density per square mile of 1,874. Houston, the city of Houston in general, has a population per square mile of 3,662 per square mile. And then, so we're just using this to kind of like gauge where we're at. And New York City's population density at this time, we'll write down, was 200,000 people. 200,000 people. So just think about like your neighborhood, think about, the people that you see out walking their dogs, riding their bikes, trying to stay outside as much as possible to break out the monotony of quarantine. LaPorte has 1,874 people per square mile. Houston, an average 3,662. The Lower East Side at this time in the 1890s, 200,000 people per square mile. I mean, that is incredible conditions. And New York City still to this day is incredibly, the leader of population density, which is one reason why they've gotten hit so hard by the coronavirus, is that, they're living so close together. They don't have the same way the suburb setting like we have today. They are living so close. They travel on trains, they travel in subways, they're walking down the sidewalks that are often crowded together, which is why New York City has gotten hit the hardest of the coronavirus. And states like Texas and other Western states with, lower population densities, we've done a bit better, So definitely New York City has some major challenges at the time. It says that the working poor often lived in the worst neighborhoods. These worst neighborhoods are called slums. And we still have slums today. When we think about slums, we often think about slums in third world countries. But really, like the slum conditions that we see in New York City in the 1880s and the 1890s, they're going to be very similar to situations that we would see in slums in different parts of the world today. There's actually going to be a video that I'm going to sign, about a 10-minute video that's going to look at some photographs that were taken with new technology. We have photographs with flash, which is like a new technology that's going to be able to take photographs in places that were dimly lit, places that didn't have really good lighting. And New York residents, for the first time, because of the role of newspapers and journalists, are going to start to see what are the living conditions of working poor, make people really evaluating how their society should be structured. it says that, and then after that, there's like a diagram, a cut diagram of kind of like what these tenements look like, these incredibly cramped places with a lot of times there would be no window access at all. Common problems, disease was a common problem for sure. And one common disease that will be a problem, and this is a waterborne disease, meaning that because of lack of sanitation, wouldn't be able to hands properly, wouldn't be able to problem. That is going to be a killer for sure, cholera. And as these tenements are growing, as disease becomes a problem, as crowded conditions become a problem, as fire, becomes a huge issue. If these buildings are so tightly packed together in places like New York City, and if there's a fire in one building, you know what that fire is just going to do? It's going to spread to the next building. If there's a fire in one mid-rise, it's just going to spread to the next one. So we see cities changing, and cities are starting to grow in some of the services that they provide. Cities slowly begin to develop police and fire stations in the way that we know and the way that we have today. They began to form police and fire stations in the way that we know and the way that we have today. Because if you don't have these basic things, if you don't have fire stations and a fire breaks out, we saw with the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, how a simple thing, lit cigarette or whatever the case may be, can end up not only destroying a building, destroying an industry, but destroying actual lives. And so we wanted to do the best we could to guard against this. We see some of these services being provided for the first time. And industrialization, it says, slowly led to better lives for some. It slowly led to better lives for some. And this is the thing about capitalism, is that capitalism is the player in all these different things. Capitalism is what is driving industrialization. Capitalism is what's driving factories. Capitalism, to some degree, is creating a situation where you have these crowded tenements, where these diseases like cholera. Cholera, I think, is a disease where you get like chronic diarrhea as you've you consume typically water that's been tainted with fecal material, and you get diarrhea, and this can kill you because of dehydration, particularly the young people who are little and cannot afford to lose that kind of body weight. This is one of the reasons why babies are born with such high levels of fat. They're born healthy. Babies are accruing a lot of fat, and that's really good, because if they do get sick, they have some body weight that they can lose. This is something that has been built into them to protect them. You want these babies to have that kind of fat. But if these babies get diarrhea, and it's a chronic diarrhea that just won't stop, it becomes really concerning. They start losing weight, and then eventually babies die. And so we do see cholera from these types of conditions. And people can look at these factories and these housings and say, wow, capitalism's the problem. That's definitely what Karl Marx said. You might remember that Karl Marx looked at choices. He said, we can either reform this situation or have revolution. And Karl Marx and others said, yeah, revolution, workers of the world unite. But this phase, things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire were terrible things, but it caused people to unite and fight for more rights. These housing conditions were terrible. And once these conditions were exposed, we'll watch a video a little bit about how these housing conditions were exposed, people would start fighting for it to get better. And so there's this tension where capitalism doesn't promise anything necessarily, but what we see is, for many people, we see the slow progress of standards of living for people, slowly. Now, some people get rich quick, some people get wealthy quick, they're living great lives. But for the average worker, there's a general, and maybe for some people, painfully slow progress as things get better. And socialists and communists said, well, that's not okay, because while I'm waiting for things to slowly get better, the rich are getting rich today. While I'm waiting for things slowly and getting better, people are dying today. And so socialists and communists said, look, we need to do something a lot more drastic. than waiting for these slow changes. But things did slowly get better for some. It says that life got better, in particular for members of the middle class. Lives got better, in particular for members of the middle class. And this idea that you could, with education, that you could, by managing a factory, that you could do well. This is one of the things that people saw in America that caused people to get on boats to cross the Atlantic Ocean. This caused people to leave even places we'll see like China. Chinese migrants, thousands of Chinese leave China for hopes of a better life in the United States. The United States is this magnet drawing people. And so it does get better for some, in particular for members of the middle class. The promise for a better life led many people to leave the country for the city. It caused many people to leave the country for the city. And we also see that not just there's all kinds of people are going to be leaving the country, moving to the city. There are some educated people who see that there's going to be opportunities for them to move to the city to do well. But there's also poor people who realize, what? I don't have skills. I don't have education. But you know what there is in the city? There's factories where I can work and I can do well. Even in 2020, there are some individuals who they may not do well in high school. There's some individuals that choose not to go to college or can't afford to go to college, and they go to work some of the plants that we have in the Houston area. And there's people who work in the plants with very little formal education. There's people who work in the plants who didn't do well in school. They're making a lot more than a public school teacher who has a 4-year degree or sometimes a master's degree. There's people working in the plants that are making twice what a public school teacher can make. And they're seeing those opportunities in these industries and these factory settings. And even though the average person isn't moving to the city and becoming, like this, incredibly wealthy person, there was the sense that opportunity was there if you're willing to put in the time and the expense of your, sometimes your safety. It says that these in these factory settings, there's a major impact. There's an effect on the class structure. Those who had jobs in mines and in factories were referred to as the working class. If you had this physically intensive job, if you had this job where you're it's the sweat of your brow, you're sweating, you're physically working, you're putting a hard day's work in, you're in a mine, you're in a factory. The word for those individuals is you are part of the working class. And the thing about factories is that to some degree early on, factories had hurt the ability of an average person to make money, because there used to be something called artisans. An artisan was someone who could make a shirt from start to finish. They weaved, they dyed it, they sewed it all together. All that kind of stuff was made by someone with that skill. People made chairs, people crafted things, out of wood, all these different skills that people had. These people were artisans. But remember, in factories, one of the things that I can do in a factory is I can break down things into quick steps. I can break down things into very simple, repetitive tasks. And once I have assembly lines later on, once I have mass production, I can actually take it where I take one factory worker and his job all day long is to do task X. I have another factory worker, their job all day long is to do task Y. And I've broken down manufacturing into very simple, repetitive steps. And so you don't have artisans making stuff anymore. You have factory workers who are just cranking out stuff at incredible speeds. Now, the great thing about that is that what does that do to the price of goods? Well, the price of goods goes down. What does it do to the accessibility of goods? Being able to get those goods, the ability to get those goods becomes just available to everyone. So those are all good things. But what does that do to the wages of people? What does that mean? Am I going to be paying a person who does one simple repetitive task all day competitive wages? And the answer is no. So there's, some positives and there's some negatives about how all of this works out. It says interchangeable parts and industrialization meant that workers had fewer skills. Interchangeable parts and industrialization meant workers had fewer skills. You know, um, there's a guy named Eli Whitney. You guys remember him? He invented something called the cotton gin, because cotton at this time in the 1700s, it was expensive because you had these seeds that was inside the cotton, and it took a lot to manually remove those things. So he invented this invention called the cotton gin, and it mechanically separated the seeds. That's a wonderful invention in many ways. It makes shirts and cotton cloth affordable. It also increases the financial incentive to own slaves. That's terrible. Um, but he also invents interchangeable parts, where that means, like, if you have a gun, a rifle, and like the hammer breaks or a part of the rifle breaks, well, you could just take that broken part off and you can go and buy another part. It's not like every single rifle, every gun is unique. If you have if you have plumbing, and there's plumbing that has to be replaced, why standard? Nuts are standard. Screws are standard. They're interchangeable parts. And this invention of interchangeable parts makes things easier. And as it makes things easier, it makes production faster and cheaper. And it also makes these workers to actually need less skills to be able to make these things. Products were made quickly and products were made cheaply as a result of industrialization. Products were made quickly and cheaply. And the people who were in charge of these workers now that you're in charge of these workers, managers saw their workers as really just as expendable. If one of these workers causes problems, if one of these workers raises issues, these workers can be disposed of, because the truth is there's some other worker that I can just pick up off the street. And if one worker's causing problems, one worker doesn't like the work, one worker is asking too many questions to that worker, and just replace that worker with someone else, because you know what? They're super expendable. They can be replaced because that person doesn't really have a lot of skill. They just sit on this line all day doing one repetitive task again and again and again. So this is going to be, sadly, the way that managers and factory work owners often looked at their workforce. They're expendable people I could just go ahead and throw out the door if there's problems. These uneducated workers were known as blue collar workers. They're called blue collar workers. They are people that work in factories. There are people who work in mines. We call them blue collar workers. Those with some education who would manage these workers were the new middle class. People with some education who would be the managers. They would manage these workers. They would form a new middle class. And there's a name for these people. The name for the managers, name for the people in charge of the factories or running the factories for the owner. This new group of middle class people, they were that worked in offices, were known as white collar workers. These people who often worked in offices were known as white collar workers. So you have two types of workers. You have these blue collar workers. They're the factory workers. They're in mines. Managers saw them as basically expendable, that they're not valuable. They can be quickly replaced. And then you have those blue collar workers. And then you have the people in charge of them who don't work in factories. They often sit in offices, and we call them white collar workers. We call them that way even in 2020. If you think about, like, how does your neighbor or how does your family member dress when they go working in these plants? They often work in these work uniforms that have literal blue collars, and how do professionals dress? People who've been to college, people who've been to university. How do you dress in an office? Or if you watch the show The Office, how do they dress? They are wearing, even though in the show The Office, they're a paper company, they're wearing a suit and tie with white collared shirt. These are people who literally work in an office. And so we have two types of worker: blue collar. These are people typically without an education, typically physically, active in their jobs. And then you have white collar, people who often sit all day in an office, people who've been to university, people who have some sort of education. They're white collar workers and do very little physical work. Like the most physical work I do all day is like typing on a keyboard or pressing a copy machine button. And that's pretty much it. Like that's a physical activity as I get as a white collar worker. It says an increasingly wealthy upper class were owners of large corporations. An increasing wealthy upper class were owners of large corporations. So we have the poor are the blue collar, the middle class are these white collar, and then the upper class were now actually owning large corporations. And this is something that we also see for capitalism. And we can see this as good, we can see this as bad. We have millionaires at this time, multimillionaires at this time, many of them getting their wealth from corporations. They were a name for these elite few people, these people that were incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential. Sometimes these incredibly wealthy elite individuals were known as captains of industry. They were called captains of industry because these people were leaders. These people were incredibly influential. They were captains of industry. They were important to their societies because of their role as factory owners, as corporate owners, and their role in society was a new role that we have not quite seen today. In fact, it says they became more important than people who were wealthy landowners. These captains of industry became more important than people who were wealthy landowners. Forever and ever and ever, it had been the most important people in the world are people who owned land. But now you have these incredibly wealthy individuals who don't own land. They own corporations. Like think about people who famously wealthy in the 21st century, people like Bill Gates, people like Steve Jobs. These people, Mark Zuckerberg, Bezos of Amazon, these people are wealthy today, but they're not wealthy because of like all the land they own. These people are wealthy today because of the corporations that they own. And that's like a huge change because forever and ever and ever and ever, people were wealthy based on, well, I'm wealthy because I own land. That's not why Jeff Bezos of Amazon's wealthy, because he owns land. That's not why Zuckerberg of Facebook is wealthy, because he owns land. These people are wealthy because of the corporations that they have. And this is a huge, 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 huge change. These increasingly wealthy upper class were owners of large corporations. And that's a huge change as they became more influential than people who had been wealthy landowners. So let's look at farm work versus factory work. Before industrialization, parents and children often worked close together. So for sure, like if I live in a factory, in a farm, my kids are going to work, they're going to be milking the cows, they're going to be collecting eggs, but I'm going to be close by. In the farm, we are both working, but we both work close together. And for those women in particular that did work, they would often work from their home. And there's a word for that. We've actually talked about this word before. Many worked in what's called cottage industries in their home. Cottage industries are home. This is where you make stuff from home. In particular, the most common type of cottage industry was often spinning fabric, meaning that as a woman, you are working from your home, and in your home, you're making fabric. You're working from your home. You're spinning in your house, and you're working to provide for your family, but you don't even have to leave your house to do that. Well, that's fine. But when the Industrial Revolution comes, it's going to change all of that. it's going to change all of that. In fact, these industrial machines, they're going to start, we've talked a little bit about this in a previous lecture, they're going to be creating so much and so quickly. These industrial machines were so big that now work had to be done in factories. It doesn't make sense if I could hire 200 women to work these machines to crank out these tons of fabric versus like some woman by herself in her house doing it by hand. I'm not going to pay for that. Progress is going to leave that woman behind. And as a result of that, these industrial machines so big, work had to be done now in factories. Adults now had to work outside of their homes and neighborhoods. Adults now had to work outside of their homes and neighborhoods. So now a woman is in a transition point where she used to be able to stay home. She used to be able to work at home and provide for her family without ever leaving her house. But now women are in a situation where they just don't make enough money to provide for their families. And now they have to leave their house and go work in a factory just to make sure their family can make it. It says workers now worked 14-hour days. In our country, in America, a nine to five is considered pretty common for like professional hours. A 9-hour workday is pretty common for what's considered professional work hours. But workers at this time were working up to 4-hour days, often 6 days a week. And these are problematic conditions. If you are living in poor tenements, if it's crowded, if it's not healthy conditions, and then you're working exhausted 14 hours, this is a recipe for disaster. It was often, it was common for exhausted workers to experience injuries and even death. If you're working in these factories, you're exhausted. People are going to make mistakes. People make mistakes today, but if you are just working exhausted and there's not like compensation the way we have today, there's a real famous book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. And in this book, he talks about there's meat processing plants in Chicago. And it talks about that sometimes, accidents would happen. You're slaughtering cows, and these cows butchered and chopped up and made into sausages, things like that. And sometimes there'd be accidents would happen. And for example, a guy's hand would get chopped off. It would get pulled off in the processing of the machinery. But because of these factories were just churning out numbers of tons of processed beef so quickly, there was no time to shut it down. And so workers might lose fingers or a hand in these machines that were grinding up food to feed Americans, and it would just get ground up in it. And these were the conditions that some factory workers had to deal with. They had to experience. They experienced injuries and sometimes death. Well, what effect did this have on kids? Because of low factory wages, parents felt forced to send their children to work. They felt forced to send their children to work because mom's not making a lot at the factory. Dad's not making a lot of factory, but I got these 4 kids. They're going to do something. My 12-year-old's going to do something. My 14-year-old's going to do something. There's, remember, not public school as institutions yet. Many kids, even actually around the world, like if we're going to share our coronavirus experiences, for us, it means, well, for some of us, for some Americans, it's like, well, I spent a lot of time watching Netflix. Oh, well, I spent a lot of time visiting my fridge throughout the day. I spent a lot of time on my phone, for not for all of us, but for some of us, for sure, as Americans, that's like what a lot of us are doing. A lot of us are going to come out of quarantine heavier than we entered quarantine. But for other people around the world, quarantine, kids work, and for them not to work means their family doesn't have food. We in the United States have public education, free public school. They're even giving free laptops and internet service to people who don't have it. Around the world, it's not like that. And at this time, it definitely wasn't like it. People were working and they felt they had to send their kids to work. At the start of industrialization, children could work as young as 5 years of age. as young as age 5, kids were going to work. And why would I send a 5-year-old to work? Like maybe for some of you think that's counterproductive. I wouldn't want my 5-year-old brother, my 5-year-old sister at the factory, at the plant with dad. But the thing is that they're small size, the size of a 5-year-old. Their small hands allowed them to work in mines. Mines are these cramped conditions, perfect size for kids. Their hands are small, so when these big factory machines get jammed with something, these kids with their little hands, they can get in there, they can pull stuff out. Even like at the high school, there's a copy machine that we have that breaks all the time, and there's places that little fragment paper get into, and I have to like try to get my hand in there to find it and pull it out. With these huge machines, same thing's happening. They're sending these little kids to work in these factory settings, and it's pretty horrific. Charles Dickens, who wrote The Christmas Carol, I think we talked about this. He himself, his dad, got in so much basically credit card debt, like the equivalent of credit card debt. Charles Dickens' dad went to debtor's prison at the time. You went to jail for not paying your bills, and your kids would be sent to work in factories. That's what Charles Dickens grew up doing. He grew up working in a factory, and that impacted him so much. He writes and reflects about the things that he saw and experienced when he writes things like A Christmas Carol. And you have these poor working class people, in need. Charles Dickens experienced that in the 1800s. So these kids are being forced to work. Their effects on women's lives. Working women often had to enter the workforce. Working class women often had to enter the workforce. So your husband is in a factory and he's just not making enough money to provide for the family. Women were forced by economic necessity to enter the workforce, to leave the house. Primarily, the number one job that women in factories and in cities, they worked in textile factories. Textiles are making cloth and fabric. We saw this in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. And one of the reasons why women were so desirable to work in these factories was they were often paid half of what men were paid. And women, you might remember, could not vote. And if you have a group of people that don't have the right to vote, it's going to be really hard for them to be able to fight and to organize and to get legislation that's going to represent them. One of the things that we see in the 19th, 20th century is more people have the right to vote, the more rights are being earned by those new voting people. There was something we talked about in the past called Jacksonian democracy. There was originally people could only vote if they were white and wealthy landowner people. But once we start getting rid of land requirements, we get rid of what's called poll taxes. You used to actually pay a fee to vote. There was literacy tests. You had to show that you could read. Once we got rid of literacy tests and poll taxes and things like that, the more that regular people, whether it be white or black or brown, could vote, the more those voting people could actually start to earn some rights. And so women, sadly, at this time, they have to leave their house. They have to work, but they're making half of what men did, primarily working in textile factories. That's where they're working in, primarily in textile factories, being paid half of what men paid. Wives who could stay at home was an indication that their husbands were wealthy. If you met someone and you're like, oh, okay, well, what do you do? What factory do you work in? You're like, oh, I actually don't work in a factory. I'm a full-time mom. People are like, wow, your husband must be really well off, or your husband must be paid really well because you don't have to go work. Women who could stay home became a bit of a status symbol. Upper class homes, a housewife became just that. The housewife became a status symbol. If you can afford for your wife to stay home without working, you've made it. You might remember something related to this, in China, that there was sometimes they did something called foot binding, where they would take a young girl's foot and break it and bind it throughout the years, breaking, binding, making her foot way smaller than it was ever naturally meant to be. But this meant that it actually hurt a woman to walk. It would be difficult for her to do physical tasks. And if you were a man and you had a wife who had her feet bound, this was a status symbol. People would look at you like, wow, you could afford to have a wife with bound feet. you must be wealthy because you're so wealthy, you can afford for your wife to stay home. In a related way, this becomes a status symbol. In our world in 2020, it's kind of weird. It seems like stay-at-home moms are often looked down upon in 2020. There's almost the expectation in 2020 that women are not doing something meaningful with their lives if they are not outside of the home. And there's a bit of a debate in our culture. Is it okay for a woman to say, I don't really want to go to college. I just really want to be a mom. I want to be a full-time mom. I want to take care of my kids. There's a bit of debate because we hear people saying, well, you're not really living up to your expectation. What you need to do is go to college. What you need to do is work outside of the home. What you need to do is, put your kids in daycare. And there's a debate in our country about what is right or what is ideal. Is there a balancing of the two? Some people say yes, some people say no. So it's a discussion that we even have in our own society today. It says on your handout that in the 1800s, there became something called the cult of domesticity. A domestic means home. And so there was this idea of what the home life should be. And this idea, this standard of what home life should be was called the cult of domesticity. And it was created by two things, by advertising and consumer culture. Advertising and consumer culture. Advertising tells us that we need iPhones. Advertising tells us we need tablets. Advertising tells us we need a Netflix subscription. Advertising kind of like, you see what people are pushing and you're like, wow, I want that. You're seeing what people have and you're saying, I want that. I want the new kitchen. I want shiplap. I want stainless steel appliances. I want that certain type of, device. And the same thing happened here is that we see advertising and consumer culture producing expectations should look like. Advertised household products were supposed to make life easier. So we see actually in the early 1900s, like early vacuums being advertised and different types of things like this. And people said, well, this is what you have to have. And once you have to have this, it's going to make your life easier. The home, because of these new inventions that are supposed to help the wife clean, the home was supposed to be a clean place and a place of refuge and rest for their husbands. So it's kind of like this interesting thing that there's these new technologies like vacuum cleaners that will be coming online and becoming available for people to buy. But then with these new technologies, there's a new standard where it says, well, we have these new technologies. We have these vacuum cleaners. And now people felt that means your house needs to look at this level of standard. And later on, we're going to have dishwashers. Okay, well, we have dishwashers. And later on in the 20th century, then your dish situation, it needs to be constantly clean. We have washing machines. Well, that means that the standard is going to go up. So with all these new technologies that are developed, dishwashers, washing machines, vacuums, the standard for women, what your house should look like, goes up as well. So it's kind of like a catch-22. These machines are supposed to make people's lives easier, but the standard of how women are supposed to keep is going to actually make them work harder. So these advertised products were supposed to make life easier. The home was supposed to be this ideal place for the husband to find rest and relaxation. And actually, just like we have magazines today, parenting magazines, we see the same thing happening at this time. Pamphlets highlighted how women were supposed to run their homes. So we have pamphlets and magazines talking about that this, the ideal home should look like this. You should raise your kids like this. This is how your house should be clean. There's more standards that women are supposed to meet. These pamphlets, these magazines encourage women to be religious, and they encourage women to be submissive. This word submissive means that, they have a role in society. To be submissive means that you're obeying your husband, that you're listening to your husband, that you're supposed to do the things that he says. And so these pamphlets written by men or influenced by men are telling women this is what the standard should be. You should, even if you're a working class woman, you should have your house at this level of clean. You should have this level of work in the house. And really, at the end of the day, your job is to be a good wife. Your job is to be submissive, a religious woman. This made life harder for women who struggled to meet the standard. It was made life harder for women who struggled to meet the standard. And think about like how you felt judged. You began to feel judged if your house didn't look like these pamphlets said, if your house didn't look like these magazines. And actually, we might still have the exact same tendencies in 2020, where we are comparing one another's households because of advertising, because of TV, all these things says, oh, that's what a house should look like. Well, my house doesn't look like that. And so women at this time, they struggled as a result of this to meet this standard. These conditions would help the rise of feminism. Feminism is going to be this kind of thoughtful resistance that all these standards are being applied and pushed on women in ways that maybe are unrealistic and maybe ways that are inappropriate, especially when they don't even have the right to vote. You're putting all these standards on women, especially when they don't have the right to vote. So it says, with this, men began to take jobs, with many men leaving to take jobs. A lot of these men were leaving their homes to take jobs in other cities and in other parts of, leaving their neighborhoods, leaving all these different areas. And this would create opportunities for women. It would create opportunities for women. And one of the places that women got together, educated women, to talk about that, we should be, fighting for ourselves. We should be getting the right to vote. There was a famous meeting, a place called Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls Convention. This called for equality for women. It was here in a place called Seneca that women began to say that we need the right to vote. We're being called to do all these things. We're being called to do all these different types of standards. We need the right to vote. And that was the main takeaway from Seneca Falls. This was a women's rights convention. So quickly, effects on the environment, general trends, and then we're done. So effects on the environment, you have factories, you have cities burning fossil fuels. This causes major pollution of the cities. You have major pollution of the cities. We also have a new word being invented to kind of describe this setting. You have the word that mixes the word smoke and fog together. It is the word smog. And so this is something that has been used to describe these cities for the first time. That for the first time, you have conditions where you look outside, you cannot see buildings. As a result of quarantine, people aren't driving anymore. People are posting these pictures that you can see downtown Los Angeles now. That places that once were covered with smog don't have that anymore because people aren't driving their cars. In fact, yesterday on April 20th, the average price of gas per barrel on April 20th at the end of the day was $0 a barrel. There's been different times in our country's history where oil's been $100 for a barrel of gas. It's been $40 for a barrel of gas. But so many people are staying at home now. People aren't driving. People aren't going to work. The economies are shut down all around the world. That yesterday, oil was trading at $0 a barrel. That meant yesterday, on April 20th, oil was worthless on that day. It's never happened before in history. So we have all these things. Major pollution, smog, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases were common in these cramped conditions. They were common in these cramped conditions. Finally, some general trends to think about, and then we are done. In general, some general trends: mass production made goods quickly and cheaply. Mass production made goods quickly and cheaply. Now, there's a side effect to that. If I'm making things quickly and cheaply, That means I'm not going to make very much money making those goods. The goods are made quickly and cheaply, but people will not be paid well. People will not be paid well. Also, in general, a second trend we see is that people move from the country to the city. People moved in general to the country, to the city. They're looking for these jobs and these opportunities. They move from the country to the city. Number three, we see that work is shifting from homes to the factory. People are moving from homes to factories. And finally, cities face crowding and poverty. Crowding and poverty. These are all the things that capitalism is going to bring. These are some of the challenges. These are some of the hard things that capitalism is going to bring. And people are going to be pushed to either say we need to reform or we need to revolt. The Karl Marxes of the world, the communists of the world, will say it's time to revolt, to change things totally. Other people say we need to reform things totally. We'll talk a little bit more finally about how industrialization finishes off in our last industrialization lecture tomorrow. Until then, I look forward to seeing all of you. I look forward to working with you. I'm going to send you guys some updates on the AP testing. Keep busy, keep active, keep safe, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Or as you have questions, shoot me an email. Thank you all so much. Bye.